So, as Tim said, we're in the second week of our new sermon series, looking at the 5 trustworthy sayings endorsed and expounded by Paul in the so-called pastoral epistles written to Timothy and Titus. As Stephen mentioned last week, these slogans were presumably already familiar to the members of the early church, but Paul chooses to assert their trustworthiness and incorporate them into his teaching. Each one is prefaced by words such as, "This is a trustworthy saying," to signpost the veracity Paul wishes to ascribe to them. And today's topic is no exception. As we heard in our first reading, the passage began, "Here is a trustworthy saying. Whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task." But last week's saying seemed a much more obvious choice by Paul, don't you think? Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, has the sound of a creed-like statement to declare your faith in, as opposed to today's topic, which states that the role of overseer is a noble task. Yet Paul felt it was important enough that he included it within his choice of just a handful of sayings, and indeed used it as a launch pad to get to grips with the surrounding topic. So we'd better take this trustworthy saying seriously too, and consider some what questions to help us to do so. What is an overseer? What about women? What do we look for in an overseer? What qualities does God expect? And what about the rest of us? So firstly, what is an overseer? There's a vast spectrum of titles given to those in leadership in churches, depending on denomination, tradition, location, and many other factors. Some you might have heard of are minister, vicar, priest, rector, pastor, parson, or elder. But there are plenty more besides. Fortunately, the Bible keeps it simple, and there are just 2 positions of church leadership referred to: overseer, sometimes translated as elder, and deacon. The overseer or elder is the one with the main leadership role, focused on the spiritual oversight of the church community and making decisions about how to best serve the needs of the people. The deacon's role is to assist the overseer, serving under their authority and more focused on meeting the practical needs of the church. If you're interested in understanding how these 2 roles complemented each other, there are a number of passages which you can read in Acts and in the pastoral epistles which describe and compare these positions. But this morning we will just be focusing on the role of overseer. Paul describes this as a noble task, and it's interesting to note that he says that it's the task which is noble, rather than the position, role, or status. Our second passage from 1 Peter 5 can help us see why, as it spells out the service and dedication that the role requires. The elder or overseer is likened to a shepherd who loves to watch over their flock, rather than just doing it out of duty, and who is eager to serve. Rather than lauding their position of leadership over the church members, they will seek to be an example to them, following in the footsteps of the chief shepherd, Jesus, who was the greatest example of sacrificial service. In the rest of our main passage from 1 Timothy 3, Paul will draw out the qualities which God expects of an overseer in order for them to be the right person to serve and shepherd their church. But before we get to grips with that, there are a couple of important questions for us to consider, the first of which is, what about women? It has to be said that the majority of English translations of this passage majorly let us down and unfortunately lead us to a skewed understanding. If you read the repeated use of masculine pronouns throughout these verses, describing the qualities needed in an overseer, and indeed the other passages on similar topics, you would assume that Paul is saying that only men can take on the role. And indeed, people do quote such passages as part of their evidence when arguing that point. But a very short grammar lesson, can provide vital information. Ancient Greek, just like Latin, which may be more familiar to some of you, does not routinely use pronouns with verbs, because the ending of the verb signifies who is doing it. For those who studied Latin, reciting a mo, a mass, a mat, etc. might ring a bell, with that change of ending telling us who is doing the loving. I love, you love, he or she loves, and so on. If you wanted to make explicit or emphasize who is doing something, they did have pronouns you could use, but this was a rare occurrence. In our passage from 1 Timothy 3, Paul simply uses the third person singular ending, meaning he or she, and does not choose to add an explanatory or emphatic male pronoun, which he surely would have done if this role was to be limited to men. There is one of the qualities listed, which we'll be looking at shortly, which is specifically referring to a man, faithful to his wife, or literally a one-woman man. But polygamy and adultery were at that time generally considered to be the responsibility and decision of the man, and a woman with many husbands was practically unheard of, as opposed to a man with multiple wives. So this is not a decisive argument either. On the contrary, Paul is actually at pains throughout 1 Timothy to encourage women to pursue the qualities which he describes as being requisite to an overseer. It would certainly be strange for him to extol these things if the role this qualifies them for is not actually open to them. We could go on debating this for much longer time, but we need to press on and consider briefly, what do we look for in an overseer? It's interesting to stop for a minute and reflect on what we consider to be important attributes or characteristics in a minister. Someone young and dynamic, or older with greater experience, outgoing with a great sense of humour, or someone reflective who is a good listener, highly qualified with the best degrees and training, or someone with a broad life experience before coming into ministry, someone who values the traditional way of doing things, or an outside-the-box, blue-sky thinker. Obviously, those in ministry can be a mixture of many of these traits and qualifications, and as such can bring a wealth of experience, energy, and aptitude to the role. But we should be honest in acknowledging that our shopping list of what is important to us will inform and shape our opinion of those in ministry, especially if their vision for the church and their priorities and decisions are in conflict with the way we'd like things to be done and the direction we see the church going in. As we go on now to discover what God's priorities and expectations are when it comes to the leaders in his church, let's pray that these will become the key characteristics we look for too. So let's consider, what qualities does God expect? Verses 2 to 7 of our passage from 1 Timothy goes on to list 15 characteristics which God desires in a church leader. And unlike the criteria for leaders of other organisations, things like charisma, intelligence, and eloquence don't make the list. With 15 qualities to get through, we'd better crack straight on. First, above reproach, sometimes translated as blameless. Now, this cannot mean that the minister has never made a mistake or done anything wrong, because that would discount everyone from taking up the role. One commentator I read interpreted this as there being nothing in the minister's demeanour or behaviour no flaw or persistent action which gives critics of God's church a foothold to criticize or attack. The famous American novelist Mark Twain grew hostile towards the church, the Bible, and Christianity because of his experience of church leaders. He wrote about church elders he knew growing up who owned slaves and abused them, and ministers who quoted the Bible to justify slavery. He spoke of church leaders who he heard using foul language or practicing dishonesty during the week after listening to them extolling piety in church on a Sunday. Although he saw a genuine love for God and in turn others in the lives of some church members, including his mother and wife, he was so disturbed by the poor example of those in leadership positions that he became bitter towards the church and as a result towards God. Those leaders known to Mark Twain certainly couldn't be described as above reproach or blameless. And if a church leader is failing in the subsequent areas which we're now going to consider, he or she is also not going to be above reproach. If they are above reproach, it will be because the qualities we're about to examine are apparent in their life. And the second quality on the list is faithful to his wife, or more literally, the husband of one wife, or a one-woman man. Aside from the issues this throws up when considering the role of women in ministry, as we considered earlier, this requirement has also caused other questions to arise, such as, does a church leader have to be married? And what about if they are widowed or divorced? But it is the character we should be considering rather than the logistics. The minister should be faithful and committed if they are in a relationship, and should maintain holy expectations in this area, whether they are married or single. The terms adulterer or philanderer are the opposite of what we should see in the life of a minister. How they speak of and relate to others should be above reproach, honouring both God and those they are interacting with. The next quality listed is temperate, sometimes translated as sober-minded. This speaks of a leader who can keep a clear head in all situations, remaining calm and collected, and not jumping from one thing to another all the time, swayed by the latest fads. Self-controlled is next on the list. The church leader should be governed by an inner discipline which enables him or her to resist any besetting temptation, as well as the urge to fly off the handle. In his second letter to Timothy, Paul writes that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of self-control. And church ministers should exemplify this to their flock. The story goes that Lady Bird Johnson, the wife of US President Lyndon B. Johnson, told him bluntly when he was somewhat overweight, "You can't run the country if you can't run yourself," prompting him to find the self-control and discipline to lose 23 pounds. The church leader similarly needs, with the Spirit's help, to display the discipline to keep himself or herself under control so that he or she can in turn run the church. While we've got that picture of Lyndon B. Johnson on the screen, it struck me to just consider the parallels with leaders of our countries as opposed to leaders of our churches. Paul is specifically talking about church leaders in this passage, but at the moment in our world there are so many leadership and general elections going on in so many different countries, including obviously our own and the United States. And it is interesting to draw the parallels that God talks about leadership being a noble task rather than being about status and position, and that it's a position in which you serve and put the needs of others first. and also the call to be above reproach and blameless and a great example to those who you're serving. And it's interesting to think of what's going on in the United States at the moment, where one of the candidates is perfectly permissible to have just been found guilty of multiple crimes. It's not the place to debate that now, but it's an interesting thing to think about. And we should obviously be praying for those who are putting themselves forward into positions of leadership, and praying for ourselves as we make our decision about who to vote for, that we would look for some of these similar qualities which are called for church leaders in those who are in these ultimate positions of leadership in our countries. Okay, I'll go back to the script now. Next we come to respectable on the list, sometimes translated as orderly, dignified, or well-behaved. But all these renderings end up sounding rather square or even pompous. The word simply means that the minister should be someone who will be considered worthy of respect due to the way they conduct themselves, which in turn will open the door for their work for God to reach more and more people. Hospitable is the next characteristic listed. The church leader cannot be a person who only loves books and ideas and spending hours on end in their study, and rather wishes they didn't have to deal with the people who distract them from that. They need to love the people they serve, welcome them, and share their lives with them, demonstrating God's love in practical and wholehearted ways, as well as by what they say. Perhaps the following attribute seems more obvious, as it is able to teach. This presupposes two things: someone who has studied and has discernment and understanding of God's word in the Bible, and secondly, someone who has the ability to communicate this successfully. Different church leaders will have different manners and styles, and there isn't only one way to teach, but the church leader should be enabled to explain the truth effectively. I'm sure many of us can think of a minister we've encountered who often seemed to have a wonderful message they'd been given by God to share, but didn't have a clue how to go about communicating this in a way that was understandable or memorable. Or conversely, a minister who certainly had the gift of the gab, but there was no substance or edifying nature to what they chose to share. God's will would be for both elements to be present. Not given to drunkenness is next. The minister doesn't need to be teetotal, but the self-control we've already mentioned should extend to their relationship with alcohol, and indeed any potentially addictive substance or activity. The only spirit influencing their decisions should be the Holy Spirit. Cheesy line. We'll look at the next three characteristics as a group: not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome. Some translations do away with the violent aspect and use not quarrelsome, but forbearing, although the sense of a physical element to the quarrelling is certainly there in the original Greek. While the church leader may well have a call to stand up for truth and justice, they shouldn't give in to the urge to pick a fight with anyone, and should deal with any conflict which arises with gentleness and love. The minister shouldn't be marked by stubbornness, nor always insist on his or her own point of view, believing that to be the only opinion that counts. They must be able to get along with others and work through issues which arise calmly and lovingly. Not a lover of money is next on the list, which could be translated as not covetous. Money should not be the driving force in the church leader's life, nor keeping up with the Joneses. That doesn't mean the church leader can't have money. It's his or her attitude to money which is the litmus test. It's possible to be destitute, but overwhelmed by an all-consuming desire to get rich, just as it is to be wealthy, but to acknowledge this as a blessing from God, which you steward and use according to his guiding and instruction. Now we have an entry to our list of characteristics, which is described in greater detail in verses 4 and 5. He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him, and he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? This is not suggesting that a minister's family life will be perfect, with perfectly behaved children who have perfect lives. It does mean that when issues and problems arise in the family setting, the church leader will be enabled to handle things in a godly way, modelling Christian virtues and dealing with matters of discipline appropriately. These are the qualities they will also need when it comes to handling the problems and issues which crop up in the church family too. Verse 6 has some further wise advice. He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. Paul is warning against putting new believers into leadership roles that they are not yet ready to handle. They need to be discipled and built up in their faith before being given too much responsibility. Otherwise, they could succumb to pride, seeking glory and recognition for themselves rather than God, and facing judgment as a result. One final characteristic is to be found in verse 7. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders, so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. A church leader who gains a poor reputation in the community will not be able to draw others to Christ as they should, and will be a poor representative for the body of Christ. And that's the end of the extensive list, featuring some more obvious qualities and other more challenging expectations. But we're left with a final question. What about the rest of us? Unless at some point we happen to be charged with the task of being involved in the selection of a church leader, we might be wondering if there's any way to apply today's passage as we go out into the week ahead. Well, firstly, we should be praying for those in leadership in the church, both locally, our minister here at Christ Church, Stephen, other local ministers, and then ministers further afield too, that they would be equipped and enabled, refined and honed as they seek to follow more closely the example of Jesus and live up to the challenges and guidance provided in our passage today. If you get a chance to read the passage again and look through those 15 qualifications which God desires, it's a really challenging ask, and we should be praying for those in leadership that they would be enabled to live up to that calling. But we should also notice that almost all of these characteristics are ones that we should aspire to as well. Not because we're planning a move into church leadership, although you might be, that's up to you, but simply because they are Christ-like qualities, which will help us to grow in our walk with God and also provide a witness of the work of God in our lives to those we encounter day by day.